Every monster has a beginning. Every villain was once a child. This is the story of Marcus Thorne, a tale of innocence corrupted, of choices made and unmade, and of the thin line between victim and perpetrator. What you're about to witness is not a story of evil born, but of evil created. This journey begins in a place of ordinary sadness, in the spaces between love and neglect, in the moments when a child learns that the world is not kind, and that kindness is a luxury he cannot afford. Marcus Thorne was born on a gray November morning in a small industrial town called Riversedge. His mother, Eleanor, was a nurse who worked double shifts at the county hospital. She was dedicated, competent, and perpetually exhausted. His father, David Thorne, was a construction foreman who disappeared when Marcus was just 3 years old. Eleanor never spoke poorly of him. She simply said he wasn't ready to be a father, and left it at that. She raised Marcus alone, working nights and weekends, doing everything she could to provide a stable life for a son who barely remembered his father's face. Eleanor did everything she could to provide for her son. She worked nights, weekends, and holidays. She packed his lunches, helped with his homework when she could stay awake long enough, and tucked him into bed, even when she had to leave an hour later for the evening shift. But even her dedication couldn't fill the void left by his father's absence. Marcus learned early that love was something demonstrated through paychecks and exhaustion, not through presence and attention. He learned that sacrifice was the primary currency of affection, and that he should be grateful for crumbs of time scattered throughout the week. He learned to be quiet. He learned to take care of himself. He learned to want less, because wanting more only led to disappointment. At Riverside Elementary School, Marcus was quiet. Teachers described him as well-behaved, but withdrawn. He was the student who did his work, turned it in on time, never caused problems, and was easily forgotten. He didn't have many friends. The other children seemed to operate by rules he didn't understand. Their social games seemed frivolous and confusing. Their need to bond over shared jokes and experiences felt alien to him. During recess, while other kids played tag and traded baseball cards and made plans for after-school adventures, Marcus sat alone on the bleachers, watching them with an expression of cold fascination. He observed how they formed hierarchies, how they excluded others, how they performed their friendships for an audience. He was like a scientist studying a different species, taking mental notes on the mechanics of human connection without understanding the emotions that drove them. Marcus excelled in his studies because studying was something he could do alone. He found comfort in mathematics, in the absolute rules of grammar, and the clear right and wrong answers of history and science. The world made sense in textbooks in a way it never made sense in the hallways and playgrounds. He spent his time in the library, in front of the computer terminal, in the quiet corners of the school where solitude was expected and normal. When Marcus was 8 years old, something happened that would change the trajectory of his entire life. A girl named Sophie moved into the apartment next door. She was 7, bright and full of energy that Marcus had never encountered before. Her family had just relocated to Riversedge. Her father worked in management at one of the local factories. Sophie had 2 younger siblings and a mother who seemed perpetually cheerful, despite the chaos of raising 3 children in a small apartment. For the first time in his life, Marcus experienced what might be called friendship. Sophie didn't seem bothered by his silence or his strange way of observing the world. She simply accepted him. She brought him into her world of imagination and play. She showed him how to build forts out of blankets and pillows, how to create elaborate stories about imaginary kingdoms and adventurers. Together they drew pictures, played board games, built towers out of blocks that they knocked down just to build them again. They sat on the fire escape during summer evenings and talked about everything and nothing. For the first time, felt seen, felt important, felt like maybe he was normal, or at least like his particular brand of strangeness was acceptable to someone. For 3 years, they were inseparable. They were each other's world. But childhood friendships are fragile things, and this one would not survive the cruelty that adolescence brings. When Marcus and Sophie entered middle school in the same year, something fundamental shifted. For the first few weeks, they remained close, walking to school together, sitting with each other at lunch, maintaining the ease of their childhood bond. But Sophie was changing. She was becoming interested in fitting in being popular, in the social hierarchies that govern the brutal ecosystem of adolescent life. She started wearing different clothes, styling her hair differently, seeking out the approval of the girls who seemed to matter. She started to notice that being friends with Marcus, the quiet boy who didn't fit anywhere, might damage her own emerging social position. At first, Sophie maintained the friendship in private. She would still talk to Marcus at home, still spend time with him when no one from school could see. But gradually, she stopped doing even that. She started staying out later with her new friends. She stopped knocking on his door. She started pretending not to see him in the hallways at school. And then came the day when everything truly broke. It was a Friday in the spring of their 8th grade year. Marcus saw Sophie in the hallway with a group of girls, including the most popular girl in the grade, Ashley Morrison. Sophie was laughing at something Ashley had said. When Sophie's eyes met Marcus's, he saw something shift in her expression. It was a moment of recognition, of connection, but it was immediately replaced with something else: shame, or maybe just strategic detachment. Marcus smiled at her, a small, hopeful gesture. It was the kind of smile that said, "I still see you. I still remember us." Sophie turned away. She didn't smile back.
Oh.
Marcus didn't need to hear what she said to know that he was the subject of their amusement. He had been a novelty to her, something interesting from her childhood that no longer served a purpose in her new life. He had been categorized and dismissed. That night, Marcus sat in his room and felt something crucial break inside him. It wasn't just the loss of Sophie's friendship. It was the loss of his last belief in the possibility of genuine human connection. It was the moment he learned that vulnerability leads to betrayal, that trust is a weapon used against you, and that the only safe option is complete emotional isolation. After Sophie's betrayal, Marcus retreated further into himself. He stopped trying to connect with other students, became the kind of person that others found unsettling without being able to articulate why. There was something in his demeanor, in the way he looked at people, that made them uncomfortable. He didn't attempt to join conversations. He didn't participate in group projects with enthusiasm. He was there, but he was separate. He was observing everything, recording everything, and revealing nothing about himself. His grades remained excellent. His teachers noted that he was well-behaved and respectful. But there was something missing in his interactions, something that prevented anyone from truly liking him or wanting to spend time with him beyond what was necessary. During his freshman year of high school, Marcus discovered the internet. It was a revelation. Here was a world where he could be anyone, where his social inadequacies didn't matter, where he could find other people who thought like him, who shared his sense of disconnection from mainstream society. He created multiple personas. He wrote things he would never say to anyone in person. He explored dark corners of the internet where people gathered to discuss philosophy, misanthropy, and their grievances against the world that had rejected them. He found communities dedicated to people who felt wronged, who felt superior to the masses, who had been hurt by rejection and betrayal. In these spaces, his bitterness was validated. A sense of victimhood was confirmed. People told him that his loneliness was not his fault, that society was corrupt and cruel, and that he was too intelligent and sensitive for this vulgar world. Eleanor noticed the change in her son, but she was too exhausted to intervene effectively. She saw him spending hours in his room on the computer. She tried to encourage him to go outside, to spend time with friends, but when he insisted that he preferred to be alone, she accepted it. She was working longer hours now, trying to save money for Marcus's college fund. She told herself that Marcus was simply going through a phase that many teenagers were withdrawn, that he would grow out of it. She didn't realize that the person she was living with was changing in fundamental ways, that the gentle, quiet boy she had raised was being replaced by something harder and more dangerous. During his junior year of high school, something happened that crystallized Marcus's worldview into something fixed and immovable. He developed a crush on a girl named Jessica Chen, a senior, who sat near him in advanced placement English. Jessica was kind, intelligent, and completely out of his league. Well, she didn't know Marcus existed. But to Marcus, she became an object of obsessive focus. He learned her schedule. He found her on social media. He read everything she posted. He imagined conversations with her, scenarios where she would suddenly notice him and appreciate the depth of his inner world. He believed that if she really knew him, if she could see past his exterior to understand the brilliance inside, she would love him. He spent weeks working up the courage to speak to her. When he finally did, it was brief and awkward. He complimented her essay on Hamlet. She thanked him politely and returned her attention to her friend. That should have been the end of it. Minor social interaction that meant nothing. But to Marcus, it meant everything. It was confirmation that she was aware of him, that he had made an impression. He escalated his efforts. He began writing her notes, which he left in her locker. He started sitting closer to her in class, trying to position himself in her line of sight. He created fake social media accounts to comment on her photos. He researched her daily life with the precision of someone conducting an investigation. Jessica found it flattering at first, then confusing, then frightening. When she finally told a teacher about the unwanted attention, the school intervened. Marcus was called to the principal's office. He was told that his behavior was inappropriate and that it needed to stop immediately. He was assigned to see the school counselor. From Marcus's perspective, he was being punished for having feelings, for trying to express himself, for daring to reach beyond his social station. He wasn't contrite. He wasn't apologetic. Instead, he was angry. He felt victimized by a system that didn't understand him, by a girl who couldn't recognize his worth, by a society that mocked and rejected him at every turn. The administration had no way of knowing how close Marcus came to doing something catastrophic. In his anger, he had written in his journal about wanting to make Jessica understand how much she had hurt him, about wanting to teach her and her friends a lesson about rejecting people like him. He researched how others had done it, how they had taken control in schools where they had been bullied and marginalized. He looked at the weapons he could access. He stood on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of violence that could have consumed him. What stopped him wasn't morality or empathy, it was cowardice. Marcus lacked the courage to translate his dark fantasies into reality. He didn't have the ability to endure the social consequences of such an act. So instead, he retreated further into the internet, into the spaces where people validated his anger and encouraged his misanthropy. He found forums dedicated to men who felt wronged by women, communities that taught him to view human beings as inherently contemptible, spaces where his rage was not only accepted but celebrated. These communities told him that he wasn't sick or disturbed. He was enlightened. He was seeing the truth that others were too weak or too indoctrinated to acknowledge. He was a member of an elite cadre of people who understood the real nature of humanity, and that understanding placed him above the masses. Eleanor found some of his browsing history by accident. She was shocked and deeply disturbed by what she saw. She confronted Marcus, demanded to know what this was about, threatened to take away his computer privileges. Marcus responded with cold rage. He told her that she had abandoned him, that she had forced him to raise himself, that she had no right to judge him for how he coped with the isolation and rejection she had created. He told her that she was part of the system that had failed him, that she was complicit in his suffering. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She had done the best she could with the resources she had available. To hear her son tell her that her best wasn't good enough, that she had somehow created this bitter, angry stranger, was devastating. She considered having him committed to a psychiatric facility. She contacted a therapist, but Marcus refused to cooperate, said nothing to the therapist. He was polite and respectful in his refusal to engage, which made it impossible for anyone to definitively say that he was a danger to himself or others. He was intelligent enough to know what to say and what not to say. He was a threat that was difficult to quantify or contain. Marcus graduated high school with a perfect GPA and a full scholarship to a prestigious state university. He moved into the dormitory in the fall, leaving Riversage behind. His mother was relieved. She had spent the last 2 years of his high school career walking on eggshells, terrified of the person her son had become, but unable to find a way to reach him. She hoped that college would be a fresh start, that Marcus would find his people, that he would somehow transform back into the gentle boy she had raised. She was tragically wrong. At university, Marcus finally had access to a community of like-minded individuals. He joined discussion groups dedicated to philosophy and social criticism. He found people who shared his worldview, who had also been rejected and marginalized, who also believed that society was fundamentally corrupt and that most people were beneath contempt. But unlike in high school, where these feelings were something to hide, in college, there was a framework through which to express and refine them. He studied philosophy with intensity, reading works about nihilism and misanthropy, carefully curating arguments that justified his worldview with the language of intellectual discourse. He was brilliant, his professors noted. He was insightful and articulate. He had a way of framing his dark observations about human nature that sounded not like the bitter rantings of a rejected person, but like the honest assessments of a penetrating mind. His essays were published in the university's philosophy journal. He became somewhat well known in academic circles for his provocative writing on the nature of human connection and the inherent cruelty of social hierarchies. He also began experimenting with relationships, or rather with his twisted approximation of relationships. He would identify women he found attractive and then deliberately construct elaborate deceptions to seduce them. He would invent entire false identities, inventing jobs and backgrounds and families that never existed. He would tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. He would perform the role of the perfect boyfriend with mechanical precision. And once he had secured their trust and affection, once they had lowered their defenses and become vulnerable to him, he would systematically dismantle their self-esteem. He would criticize them, mock them, make them doubt their own perception of reality. He would isolate them from their friends, convincing them that no one understood them like he did, that everyone else in their lives were jealous of their special connection. He would humiliate them sexually, encourage them to do things they weren't comfortable with, and then blame them for being prudish or frigid when they objected. In essence, he was practicing the infliction of pain, learning how to control and manipulate people through psychological means. What he didn't yet realize was that he was becoming everything he claimed to despise. He had begun as a victim of social cruelty, but he was transforming himself into a perpetrator. The boy who had been rejected by Sophie was now deliberately rejecting others. The young man who had felt the sting of betrayal was now betraying everyone he came into contact with. But Marcus had developed an elaborate philosophical framework that allowed him to see his actions not as cruelty, but as honesty. He told himself that he was simply stripping away the illusions that society maintained. He was showing these women what he believed to be the truth, that their worth was contingent on his approval, that they were inherently flawed, that they should be grateful for his attention, despite his contempt for them. When relationships ended, it was invariably traumatic for the other person involved. One girlfriend, Sarah, became so depressed that she required hospitalization. Another, Michelle, dropped out of school because she could unface going to classes where people might ask her about the boyfriend who had publicly humiliated her. He saw their suffering as confirmation of his superiority, as evidence that he had broken through their delusions and exposed their fundamental weakness. He discussed their emotional breakdowns with his friends with a tone of scientific detachment, as though he were documenting the predictable failure modes of inferior minds. Marcus graduated with honors, accepted a position at a think tank in the nation's capital, an organization dedicated to policy research and analysis. He was young, brilliant, and seemingly well-adjusted. He had good hygiene, excellent manners, and the ability to appear normal in social situations. He was hired immediately. No one suspected that there was anything wrong with him. He was a high-functioning predator, and he had learned how to hide the worst parts of himself behind a veneer of normalcy and intellectual superiority. His first years in Washington were dedicated to his work and to carefully cultivating his image. He published papers on social policy and economic theory. He made connections with influential people. He attended the right parties and said the right things. He dated women from prestigious families, engaging in his usual pattern of seduction, manipulation, and eventual destruction. But something changed in his late 20s. The intellectual games that had previously satisfied him began to feel hollow. Reading about human cruelty and philosophy texts was no longer enough. Engaging in one-on-one manipulation felt limited in scope. He was becoming bored with the small theater of personal relationships. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to influence the world on a larger scale, wanted his contempt for humanity to have real consequences. Marcus began to shift his focus to policy work. He started writing papers arguing for policies that would concentrate wealth and power in the hands of an elite few. Policies that would marginalize the already vulnerable. Policies that would maximize human suffering for those he deemed unworthy. He framed these arguments in the language of economic efficiency and rational analysis. On the surface, his papers appeared to be serious policy analysis. But if you read them carefully, if you understood the worldview underneath, you could see that what he was really advocating for was the deliberate infliction of harm on a massive scale. He was proposing to weaponize governmental systems against the poor, the sick, the marginalized. He was suggesting policies that would reduce access to healthcare, education, basic services for those who couldn't afford to buy them privately. He was advocating for the criminalization of poverty and the militarization of society to enforce absolute obedience. And he was doing it in such elegant, sophisticated language that many people didn't recognize the cruelty underlying his arguments. Some of his papers were taken seriously by policymakers. Some of his ideas were actually implemented. The child who had suffered in isolation in a small apartment had grown up to be someone with the power to make millions of people suffer. Eleanor died when Marcus was 32 years old. She had worked herself to death, essentially, her body simply giving out after decades of exhaustion and stress. Marcus attended her funeral and delivered a eulogy that was, to anyone listening, perfectly appropriate. He spoke about her sacrifice and dedication. He talked about how she had done the best she could with the circumstances she had been given. But internally, he felt nothing. He didn't mourn her, didn't feel grateful for her efforts. Instead, he felt a kind of vindication. She had abandoned him by working so hard, had neglected him in pursuit of financial security, and now she was gone. The universe had confirmed what he had always believed, that love was a fiction, that sacrifice was meaningless, and that everyone ultimately dies alone. Her death freed him from the last institutional connection to his past. There was no more Eleanor to worry about disappointing, no more familial obligation to navigate. He was truly unmoored from anything resembling normal human connection. By his mid-30s, Marcus had become influential in policy circles. He had access to senators and congresspeople, advised cabinet members. His papers were cited in major newspapers. He was becoming the kind of person who could actually shape the world according to his philosophy. And the world he was shaping was one of increasing cruelty, increasing suffering for the vulnerable, and increasing isolation. Consolidation of power in the hands of people like him, people who believed that they deserved to rule because they were simply superior to everyone else. The child who had been rejected by Sophie, who had been traumatized by his mother's absence, who had felt invisible and powerless, was finally finding a way to exercise power. And he was using that power to hurt people on a scale that his childhood self would never have imagined. But something was still missing. Marcus had achieved success by conventional standards. He had money, influence, and respect from powerful people, and yet he still felt empty. He still felt disconnected from genuine human experience. He realized with a kind of horrified clarity that he had become so focused on contempt that he had lost the ability to feel anything else. He couldn't feel joy, couldn't feel genuine connection. He couldn't feel satisfied. He was a machine that had been running for so long in pursuit of a destination that it had forgotten what reaching that destination was supposed to feel like. He began to seek out new experiences, trying to awaken something in himself that might be capable of satisfaction. He explored extreme sports, but they felt meaningless. He collected expensive art, but it left him cold. He had relationships with beautiful, intelligent women, but he found himself unable to sustain even the performative interests that had once satisfied him. They were all the same. They were all equally boring, equally predictable, equally beneath him. The manipulation that had once brought him a sense of power now felt tedious and repetitive. He had destroyed so many people that the act of destruction had lost its novelty. In his late 30s, Marcus experienced what might be called a crisis of meaning. He had achieved everything that his ambition had driven him toward, and it had all turned to ashes. He was living a life that looked perfect from the outside but was utterly hollow at its core. He was successful and miserable. He was powerful and empty. He was everything he had aspired to be as a child, staring at the social games of others from the bleachers, and it meant nothing. For a moment, in the darkness of his apartment one night, Marcus considered suicide. Not as a solution to his problems, but as a logical conclusion to his philosophy. If life was meaningless and people were contemptible, if the only rational response to existence was indifference, then what was the point of continuing? He stood on his balcony, 37 stories above the street, and seriously contemplated stepping off. What stopped him was on a sudden discovery of will to live, or a realization of the value of human existence. What stopped him was narcissism. Even contemplating his own death, Marcus couldn't imagine a world without him in it. His death would deprive the world of his intellect, his contributions, his presence. The world would be diminished by his absence. No, he decided. He was too important to die. The world still needed him. Instead, he tried to give his life new meaning. He threw himself into extreme forms of activism, advocating for policies that were openly cruel and antisocial. He stopped bothering with the veneer of intellectual legitimacy. He began writing manifestos that openly celebrated human suffering and argued for the creation of a society that would maximize pain for those he deemed unworthy of compassion. He started appearing on media platforms known for extreme viewpoints. He became something of a celebrity among people who shared his worldview, people who had also been rejected and marginalized, and had responded by deciding that their rejection was a sign of their superiority. He had found his audience. He was no longer alone in his misanthropy. He was surrounded by people who validated and encouraged his worst impulses. Marcus began to translate his ideas into action, founded organizations that ostensibly were dedicated to social reform but were actually dedicated to causing harm. He lobbied for policies that would devastate healthcare systems in poor neighborhoods. He advocated for increased police violence. He supported the elimination of social safety nets. He used his intelligence and eloquence to convince others that cruelty was actually kindness, that harm was actually justice, that the suffering of the vulnerable was actually the natural order of things that should not be interfered with. And yet, even as he was doing all of this, even as he was becoming the architect of widespread suffering, he still felt empty. He still couldn't sleep at night without medication. He still had moments of vertigo where he felt like he was staring into an abyss, and the abyss was staring back. He had achieved the power to hurt people on a massive scale, but it didn't give him the satisfaction he had been seeking. It only confirmed what he had suspected all along, that there was no satisfaction to be found. There was only the endless pursuit of meaning in a meaningless universe, and the translation of that meaninglessness into a philosophy that justified cruelty. Marcus had become a monster. But he wasn't a monster in the way that fairy tales depict them. He was a monster made of ordinary materials. He was a monster that looked like any other man. He was a monster that could have been prevented. If Eleanor had been able to take better care of him, if Sophie had remained his friend, if high school had been kinder, if society had offered him genuine connection instead of rejection, if his teachers had noticed the warning signs and intervened, if mental health resources had been available to him, someone had cared enough to try to reach him before he withdrew so completely into himself. There were so many moments where a different choice by someone else, or by himself, could have altered the trajectory of his life. The tragedy of Marcus Thorne is that he is both victim and perpetrator. He was harmed by systems that neglected him, and he became someone who harmed others. He experienced real pain and real injustice, and he allowed that pain to justify inflicting pain on others. He was made into a monster, but he made the choice to become one. He had agency, and he used that agency to hurt people. The world around him failed to stop him at every crucial juncture. It failed to protect the vulnerable. It failed to reach the withdrawn. It failed to intervene with the disturbed. It allowed a child's legitimate pain to metastasize into a threat that affected millions of lives. This is the story of how a child becomes a monster. It is a story without redemption because Marcus Thorne never wanted redemption. It is a story without a moral lesson, except perhaps the uncomfortable truth that we are all responsible for the monsters we create through our indifference, cruelty, and our failure to recognize the suffering of those around us. The child in the apartment watching the other children from the bleachers, watching his mother leave for work, feeling the sting of betrayal, that child deserved better. But the man he became, the man who used his intelligence and his pain as justification for inflicting suffering on others, deserved to be stopped. And the world failed to do so until it was too late.